The United States judicial system is based on a premise of a presumption of innocence. That is, proof beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was actually committed. But sometimes a fair trial is an option rather than an absolute guarantee, especially when the evidence presented is circumstantial at best. Nowhere was that better illustrated than in a trial that took place in Newport, Rhode Island in the spring of 1673. For it was there that for the only time in United States judicial history, a man was sentenced to death based largely on the testimony of a ghost. This is extremely strange. The Cornells were a prominent family who settled in the town of Portsmouth, Rhode Island in 1644. The head of the clan, Thomas Cornell, was approved admission to the settlement as a freeman, someone deemed entitled to citizenship, franchise, or other special privilege, and as such, Thomas was granted 100 acres of land into his possession and eventually was named town constable. Thomas had previously owned a public house in Boston, but was stripped of his license for various and sundry liquor-related violations. He was a direct descendant of Ezra Cornell, the founder of Cornell University, and his immediate neighbor was Edwin Hutcheson, the son of one of the founders of Portsmouth and pioneer in religious freedoms, Anne Hutcheson. He became a close acquaintance of Roger Williams, the founder of the state of Rhode Island, and in 1646 was granted a patent on a 4-square-mile area in New Netherlands, now called New York, that eventually became known as the Bronx. Some of his direct descendants include Presidents Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon, Secretary of State John Kerry, software developer Bill Gates, and famed aviator Amelia Earhart. In 1620, he married the former Rebecca Briggs at St. Mary the Virgin, Saffron Walden in Essex, England. Rebecca's brother John Briggs was also counted among the founding members of Portsmouth. They went on to have somewhere in the vicinity of 14 children, at least 11 of whom survived into adulthood, the third surviving oldest of which was Thomas Jr., who, like his father, became a well-regarded public office holder in town. Thomas Sr. passed away in 1655, and Rebecca named Thomas Jr. as heir to the estate. By 1673, Thomas Jr., his second wife Sarah, and their children were living with Rebecca at the family homestead. But the relationship between mother and son was anything but warm and caring. Friends and neighbors would speak of the horrible treatment Rebecca received at her advancing age, often not dressed appropriately for the harsh New England winters, and having to venture outside to chop her own firewood for warmth. There was also the subject of money Thomas had borrowed from his mother that was never paid back, and in many circles Rebecca considered Thomas something of a ne'er-do-well, despite his community standing, and he in turn thought of her as a nasty, selfish woman. Rebecca was also said to have confided in some friends that Thomas was just waiting for her to play out the strings, so to speak, and that his treatment of her was meant to perhaps speed up things a little bit. On February 8, 1673, Thomas spent a considerable amount of time with his mother in her quarters where they were engaged in conversation. When he exited the room, he went into another where he was seen by his wife Sarah winding a quill of yarn. Before he finished, he, along with 2 hired men who lived on the property, was called to dinner, which on this night consisted of salted mackerel. It was said that Rebecca, claiming the fish didn't agree with her, stayed in her room where she sat in front of a warm fireplace. After dinner was finished, Sarah dispatched their son Edward to check on Rebecca to ask if there was anything she needed. When he entered her room, he discovered the floor of the room on fire. Panicked, he ran downstairs to alert the others of what he had encountered. One of the hired men, a native named Henry Strait, ran up to the room, followed by Edward carrying a candle, with Thomas and Sarah close behind. Henry extinguished the fire with his hands, and then saw a body lying on the floor. He then shook the body, for whatever reason thinking it was, as he would testify, another native who had perhaps fallen drunk, and he spoke to it in native language. When Thomas saw the body, he cried out, "O Lord, it is my mother." Rebecca was found lying on her left side, her back to the bed, with her head turned toward a window. Her woolen clothing was burned, and the curtains and valance of her bed were only partially singed. Oddly, the flames had not spread anywhere else in the room, suggesting that perhaps she had lost her balance while tending to the fire, resulting in a tragic accident, and only Edward's fortunate discovery had saved further disaster. It also seemed strange that there were no screams of distress from the room, a detail that would play a larger role later in the story. The following day, authorities arrived to investigate the incident and took statements from all parties. Upon examination of the body, the coroner ruled that indeed Rebecca's death was the result of a fatal mishap. Thomas Cornell posited that ashes from the corncob pipe she enjoyed smoking may have dropped on her clothes and ignited them, yet no pipe or its remnants were found on the floor. 4 days after her death, Rebecca's brother, John Briggs, after retiring for the night, had what one could only say was a rather disturbing dream. While asleep in his bed, he felt something heave up the bedclothes twice, and at first thought somebody was getting into bed with him. He promptly awakened, turned over, and saw what appeared to be a light that he likened to the sun rising, but that gave way to the figure of a woman standing by his bed. Terrified of this spectral apparition, he cried out, "In the name of God, what art thou?" The phantom glared at him and replied, "I am your sister Cornell. See how I was burnt with fire." She then repeated that phrase again, even more forcefully. Briggs could clearly see that indeed the ghostly figure was burned about the face, head, and shoulders, and then the apparition soon vanished. Briggs convinced himself that his sister Rebecca was attempting to send him a message from beyond the grave, and he interpreted her appearance as designed to alert him that something foul and sinister had befallen her. He appealed to the local authorities to examine his sister's body once again, and surprisingly, when they agreed to do so, what they found was no less than astonishing. A suspicious wound to her upper stomach was discovered, and it was at this point the story of Rebecca's death took an unexpected turn. Based on this revelation, a jury issued a revised verdict that the injury likely also played a role in her death, but did not implicate anyone else as to its cause. It was then that rumors and innuendos began to circulate about Thomas's mistreatment of his mother and of the acrimony that existed between the two. Neighbors came forward with stories of her growing fear of her son and concerns for her own safety. Local magistrates, sensing where, no pun intended, there was smoke, there may be fire, decided to conduct an inquiry into Thomas and Rebecca's affairs and found that they had enough merit to take Thomas into custody and charge him with the murder of his mother. 4 men guarded the chained and manacled Cornell 24 hours a day, and a warrant was issued for the seizure of the Cornell estate, an action not at all unusual in these colonial times. At his trial, numerous witnesses came forward to share their accounts of the poor quality of life Rebecca endured in her home, having to perform manual labor, sleeping in an unwarmed bed, and how Thomas did not heat the home properly in the colder months. There was little effort made by anyone to care for her, and one witness, Joanne Coggeshall, told of how Thomas had argued that it was her who should be paying him rent. Her daughter-in-law, Mary Cornell, claimed Rebecca had threatened to take her own life rather than endure such mistreatment, which raised more than a few eyebrows to be sure. Witnesses George Soule and John Russell said she had shared with them her plans to move in with another son, Samuel, when spring came, as well as how she detested Sarah, Thomas's wife. One testimony given by her friend Patience Coggeshall was as follows. She was afraid there would be mischief done. Her daughter-in-law was of such a desperate spirit, for not long since, said she ran after one of the children of his first wife with an axe into her house, but she prevented her striking the child. Yet she did not live with any of her other children, because she had made over her estate to her son Thomas. If she had thought her son Thomas, first wife, would have died before her, she would not have made it over to him. There was also some doubt cast on her refusal that night to eat the mackerel that had been prepared because of her distaste for it. This was apparently news to some people who knew her. Furthermore, it was said that after her death, Thomas had told others that his mother always desired a good fire and that God had answered her calls for it. His wife Sarah had also been overheard calling her death, quote, a wonderful thing. Another witness, Mary Almy, came forward and said she had accompanied Sarah Cornell on a visit to Thomas in jail and overheard one say to the other, if you keep my secret, I will keep yours. But by far the most dramatic testimony came from John Briggs, who, upon taking the stand, detailed the story of his sister's spectral visit, and by the reaction of those assembled, it was clear that it was taken seriously and into deep consideration, especially because the discovery of her stomach wounds came as a direct result of the encounter. Now bear in mind that it would be another 20 years before the horrors of the Salem witch trials would cast their shadow on American history. Superstition or tales of ghosts and witchcraft could easily be entered into any trial as evidence of any type of crime or indiscretion. Thomas Cornell never confessed to having taken his mother's life in this gruesome manner, but was nonetheless convicted on this otherwise circumstantial evidence. The indictment was handed down on March 12th, and Cornell was tried and convicted that same day and sentenced to be hanged on May 23rd. Before his execution, some of his closer friends petitioned to the General Assembly that he be buried next to his mother. That request was denied, but a compromise was reached which would allow his remains to be buried on his own farm, with his grave being located 10 feet from the public road where a headstone could be placed in his memory. The alternative would be to bury him near the gallows where he would be hung. Thomas Cornell's execution took place as scheduled on May 23rd. His wife Sarah, who was pregnant with the couple's child during the trial, gave birth to their daughter shortly after his hanging. In what can only be considered an act of defiance and protest, she named the child Innocent. In a rare show of compassion, the General Assembly released his estate from seizure after his death, naming the town council of Portsmouth as executor. 2 years after Rebecca's death, Sarah was charged with aiding and abetting her husband in her mother-in-law's murder. A local native was also included in those charges, but neither was convicted. The original house where Rebecca Cornell died under mysterious circumstances burned down in 1889, but was rebuilt 6 years later utilizing the same plans of the original farmhouse. That home still stands today and is now the Valley Inn restaurant. The only positive aspect that came out of this was the state of Rhode Island debating and then finally concluding that spectral evidence could not be introduced as trial as evidence of a crime. And that's probably a sound premise to work under. But while you're pondering all this, here's another question. Is it possible that parenticide could be an inherited trait? Innocent Cornell would eventually marry into the Borden family, and her great-great-great-great-granddaughter would be accused and, unlike her father, acquitted of murdering father and stepmother. Her name was Lizzie Borden. All too often, people are accused of and convicted of crimes they didn't commit without a fair and impartial trial. Take Thomas Cornell, who was sentenced to death based wholly on circumstantial evidence as well as a spectral visit from the great beyond. Now listen, maybe they got the right man because he did have a motive and he did have the opportunity to do his poor mother in. But it's also a commentary on the times that the supernatural could be introduced as a valid reason to send a person to be executed. Don't believe it? 3 words: Salem witch trials, which were just around the corner. Thankfully, our system of justice grew and evolved. But we're wise to remember a time when superstition, innuendo, and religious persecution were reason enough to sentence someone to death.